MARX IS MUSS, der antikapitalistische Podcast von Linkswende. Im Folgenden hörst du eine Aufzeichnung von unserem MARX IS MUSS Kongress vom 9. bis 11. Mai 2025. In dieser Folge spricht Laura Miles von der SWP über den internationalen Kampf für LGBTIQ Rechte.
Okay, thank you very much, comrades, for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I didn't understand a word of what the comrades said because my German is virtually non-existent. I apologise for that. So it's going to be in English. I want to start really by saying, who would have thought maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, that the question of trans and trans rights would have been one of the key issues that the right are using to arm themselves and to build their side in the struggle as we move forward. And that in particular, my country, the UK, and the US would be probably the two countries where the issue has become of real prime importance. And it's crucial that the left, wherever we are, kind of gets the response right. And not all the left, I'll come on to this later, but not all the left is getting the response right in my country and perhaps in other countries as well. If you think of those two issues, as I say, the attacks on migrants and asylum seekers and refugees, and the attacks on trans, they are absolutely key really to the political situation as we see it now. I'll say a little bit about what's going on in the United States because I was pretty focused on what was going on with Trump and the United States until about 2 weeks ago when things blew up in the UK, and I'll explain how or why they blew up a little bit later. But obviously in the US, actually, these attacks on trans people, non-binary people, began really in the US around about 2014. I should say it's not just the US and UK. I know far-right organisations here, Germany, France, Hungary, and so on, are using it as a political football as well. But in the US, in the first administration, Trump's first administration, there were a number of attacks on trans people, trying to restrict trans rights to healthcare, to access to sports, to access to single-sex spaces and so on. Those attacks didn't really snowball in the way that they have with the second administration. When Trump came in on January the 20th, that day, I think it was that same day, he signed something like 200 executive orders. His right hand must have been very tired by the end of that day. 200 executive orders. And a number of those were aimed at hitting LGBT plus people. So, for example, there was one which said that henceforth, documentation and so on in federal documents and federal institutions would only be on the basis of male and female, two sexes, which kind of, if that does eventually go through, and it's the subject of some court action, so on, if that goes through, in effect, that kind of disenfranchises and denies the existence of trans people pretty completely. A lot of this is being driven in Republican states, not so much in the democratic controlled states, but in Republican states, it is a nightmare being trans. It is also a nightmare trying to get an abortion after the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2023. And of course, these attacks go hand in hand. I mean, we have to realise that. When people attack trans and non-binary people, the same people will go on to attack women's rights. They attack trans people, they will attack LGB, lesbian, gay and bisexual rights as well. So it's a kind of wedge issue. The whole attack on trans is very much a sort of a wedge issue, very consciously a wedge issue in the United States, actually. The far right, both the secular far right and the religious far right, really kind of took a decision back in about 2014, 2015, because they were faced with an issue. How do we roll back the gains that have been made in terms of same-sex marriage, in terms of LGBT rights, in terms of abortion rights, and so on? How do we turn that back? And the idea they came up with was actually to attack trans rights. And they felt that was the smallest minority, it was the weakest. If they could push through attacks on that, then they could spread that to attack LGBT people in general, but also it would be an open door to then go on and attack women's rights, and not just reproductive rights, but healthcare rights and so on. Equal pay, all of that stuff will follow from these kind of attacks. That's why it's so important that we oppose this, and we make sure we oppose it. It has got really bad in the US. A couple of weeks ago, a teacher in a primary school, I think, in Florida, was sacked because she was prepared to address one of her students by the name that they preferred. And that went through, it took them a long time to sack her. There was a petition of 5,000. There were, motions and so on, trade union motions, but they still pushed ahead and they still sacked her. In some states now, there are, by the way, something like, and this is up to April of this year, there are something like 850 state bills in different states, a total of 850 bills, which are lined up to attack trans people, well, LGBT people, but mostly trans people. 850. Last year there were, I think, about 500. The previous year, something like 300 or 400. So this thing is escalating. And those bills include things like providing healthcare for young trans people a felony, so that you will carry a jail sentence against the parents or against doctors and clinics if you provide healthcare, if you provide gender affirmative healthcare for children. It will make it an offence if you cross state lines with cross-sex hormones or puberty blocker hormones for your child. If you go into that state and you're carrying that medication, that will also be a felony. I can't remember which state it is. I think it might be Texas. Texas tends to be pretty low on the humanity stakes. But these are just illustrations of how appalling it is, really. To some extent, I'll leave that. People can talk about that if they want to. I mean, it's very, very much part of the kind of drive towards authoritarianism of the Trump regime, and it's clearly the Trump regime. I don't think Trump is actually a fascist, but there are certainly fascists in his administration, and they are moving that way. I mean, you could make an argument, actually, quite a strong one, that if he's put out about 300 executive orders now. If you are going to govern by executive orders, which are essentially diktats, it's a dictatorial regime, where previously there have been maybe one or two in a particular administration, one or two executive orders for emergency purposes or during a time of war. That's not what Trump's doing. He is not pushing anything through Congress. Congress is supposed to be the body which oversees the executive, the administration and so on, and they are bypassing that. They're increasingly bypassing that, and they're even saying things like, Trump said the other day, do I need to abide by the Constitution? But I don't know. Do I? Do I need to listen to what the courts are saying about, the deportation of people to some bloody gulag in El Salvador? Do I need to listen to that? No, I don't. And so, clearly moving towards a kind of horrible dictatorial sort of situation. We'll see how that goes. Obviously, there has been resistance. There have been mass demonstrations, and that's cheering. I have to say, the Democrats have been like, running around like headless chickens. They're like wet lettuce, they've done very little. Bernie Sanders, who's not actually a Democrat, he's an independent senator from Vermont. And Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez has been going around, and they've had some really big rallies, and it's great. And of course, Tesla shares have gone through the floor, and I actually went on a Tesla protest in my hometown in Leeds, which was organised by Democrats abroad, I think. So, there is opposition, and it needs to be pulled together, and that's great. So let me come to, yes, I spent 10 minutes on that, didn't really mean to. Right, let me come to the UK, because in the UK, it has been bad up to now, and it's just got much, much worse. Around about 2016, there's a lot of contact between far-right religious groups in the US, organisations like the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Liberty, the Koch brothers, all these kind of foundations, very wealthy, very right-wing, who have been funding a lot of the court cases and so on. But they've also been putting money into court cases in the UK through some of the organisations which have been set up. There's a whole bunch of them. They often share, you would think that, there are like hundreds of people involved. There aren't actually, because a lot of them have shared membership between the various transphobic groups. But there are a bunch of them, Sex Matters, For Women, Fair Play for Women, Women's Place UK, which has just disbanded actually, Job Done. So that, they have been funding, as has the author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, a whole series of cases that have been going through the courts to undermine healthcare and make sure young people can't get puberty blocker medication, to block people from going, trans people using gender appropriate spaces, single sex spaces, and so on. But there's a lot of interplay between organisations in the US and some of the British organisations as well. Up until fairly recently, we kind of thought, well, it's not good. They keep banging away, but we keep resisting. Trans people and the left generally, most of the left, keeps resisting. But about 3 weeks ago, on the 16th of April, there was an absolute bombshell legally. People are nodding, so I guess you've kind of heard of this. But I mean, I was actually driving to France at that point, and I heard it on the radio. I was driving with my daughter. I actually couldn't believe what I was hearing, because the Supreme Court had decided that in a case brought, it was a case brought by an organisation in Scotland, a transphobic organisation in Scotland called For Women Scotland, which had been going through the courts for about 18 months, 2 years actually, and 2 previous lower courts had thrown it out. And so they'd appealed to the next court up, and it had gone up to the Supreme Court. But the court decided that the wording in the Equality Act, the UK Equality Act, which was passed in 2010, which is one of the acts of Parliament which gives protection to trans people, specifically to trans people, and a whole number of other what we call protected characteristics, over age, over religion, sex, race, and so on and so forth, ethnicity. One of those groups is it doesn't say trans people, because it didn't use that term in those days. I know it's not long ago, is it? 14 years, but anyway, it didn't use those terms. But it talks about people who are undergoing gender reassignment, which covers trans people. Whether you have had gender reassignment or are planning to have gender reassignment. You don't actually have to have the gender reassignment, or how much gender reassignment you want is up to you, but you're still covered. Anyway, and it was assumed that was fine and permanent. The court decided that the wordings of man, woman, and sex in that act could only mean biological sex. Okay? So only biological male and biological female, which at a stroke effectively removed most of the protections from trans people. It also meant that the Act of Parliament, which had been a huge step forward for trans people, the Gender Recognition Act, which I talk a lot about in the book, which was passed in 2004 in the UK, through which you could get a certificate, a gender recognition certificate, which, and the wording of the Act says, if you have a gender recognition certificate, you will be regarded for all purposes as the sex of that certificate, not the sex of your birth certificate. The court ruling also effectively nullifies that. So we're now in a situation where the rights that trans people have had in the UK, really, I guess, over the last 20 years, are now massively under threat. It was a shock because, as I say, that we thought it would be thrown out by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court judges, by the way, somebody I know who's a solicitor said, well, the reputation of those judges is fairly liberal. You know, they're not like, I don't know, Trump's Supreme Court. He's stuffed with, far right judges. They're mostly liberal, but they've still come to that decision, and it was a unanimous decision as well, which is awful. The court didn't hear from a single trans person or a single trans supportive organisation, but did hear from a number of trans hostile organisations. So, massively biased, really. And it means it opens the door, it opens the floodgates, really, to a massive attack on what people like me have taken for granted for some time, that we can use gender appropriate facilities, that we will use women's toilets or changing rooms for swimming baths or whatever it happens to be. And now, although it's not illegal to do that yet, that ruling doesn't actually make it illegal. They are trying to make it illegal. So a body called the Equality and Human Rights Committee, which the Conservative Party has stuffed with transphobes, really. The chair of that committee is a fairly well-known transphobe, rushed out guidance within a few days, which said, now trans women, particularly, this ruling, by the way, doesn't mention trans men hardly at all, doesn't mention intersex people at all. Where on earth they're supposed to go, who knows? It really attacks trans women. And it said, trans women, now, public bodies should not be allowing trans women into women's, single spaces. Now, that's actually, we think that's wrong. We think that their interpretation is wrong, and there are legal challenges coming up against that. We think that's wrong. It was an interim ruling, and they're promising to come out with a fuller ruling shortly. But it will be just as bad because it is a horrible transphobic body, It ought to be supporting possibly one of the most, oppressed groups in the country, 1% of the population, which is trans people, and it is actually conniving in attacking those people. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. And the good thing was the response from trans people, LGBT plus people in general, because within a few days, actually, there was a very large demonstration in London. 30,000 very angry people turned out, really it was the birth of a new mass movement around trans rights, which was, really, really gratifying. Because in the days before that demonstration, what I'd seen on social media was depressing. People saying, "How do I immigrate? Could I go somewhere else? I wish I had dual citizenship with Ireland, for instance, which has a good gender recognition policy. Where can I go? Can't go to America, can't go to Hungary, and of course for most people, because this is a class issue, for most people, especially young trans people, that's just not on, is it? It's not a possibility. You don't have the material circumstances, to be able to do that. You are stuck where you are, and therefore you either have to give up or you have to fight back. And it was great to see so many people fighting back. I wasn't there because I was in France, but there were 2 demonstrations within a couple of days in Leeds, my hometown, which were big, 400-500 people, which for, a city over that issue was really big. Some of our comrades organised an online meeting about a week ago, actually, called Trade Unions for Trans Rights, because we recognise that where a lot of these issues are going to arise is in the workplace. People are going to find their employers, their managers, are they or are they not going to tell them they can't use the appropriate toilet? And then what happens if there's no other facility, if they don't have gender neutral toilets? Or, being told to use, the disabled toilet is not on. It's not okay. Those are facilities for people with disabilities. They're not for people, trans people who are not disabled. Well, some are obviously disabled, but being trans is not a disability, and it's not okay. I know some people, some on the left as well, unfortunately, have been saying, "Oh, well, the answer is need to agitate for gender neutral toilets." No, the answer is not to agitate for gender neutral toilets. The answer is to say trans people have the right to use gender appropriate toilets and gender appropriate changing rooms, and etc., etc. And that's the kind of argument we have to have with some people, I think, on the left. So that meeting, which was an online meeting, it was incredible. I managed to get onto that. 300 people, 300 trade unionists turned up for that, and they set up all sorts of union groups. They planned on producing badges, leaflets, petitions, stickers, organising a national demonstration. So there is a campaign, there is a movement developing. There's a lot of young people involved in it, and that's fantastic, because there's many more kind of young trans and non-binary people have come forward, I think, in the past 5 years, particularly the past 5, 6, 7 years, and I'm sure that's the case elsewhere as well. But it's certainly true. I've noticed in the UK, and those people are justifiably angry. Now, I've said a lot about the judgment and the implications of it, but it came on top of a whole series of other attacks, which we've had as well. So it's come on top of attacks on having puberty blocker availability. So when the Labour government came in, Wes Streeting, who's the health secretary, made permanent the ban on puberty blockers for young people, which the Tory government had put in place. They put this, they made this permanent. They also have basically put a ban on conversion therapy on the back burner. They're not going to do it, and there's a whole. They've restricted healthcare for young people and so on. So the whole situation is bad. What do we say about this? What's our position as socialists? And I think it's pretty clear, really. Our position is it's a Leninist position, it's a Marxist position. We stand foursquare, absolutely, with all the oppressed. Our starting point is solidarity with all the oppressed. You know, Lenin made that very, very clear. You know, the tribune of the people, the tribune of all the oppressed and all the exploited. It's a basic Marxist position, it seems to me, although some friends of mine who are in a different Marxist organisation don't agree with that. But there we go. I think you've probably got similar issues in here, this country as well. That's our basic position. And, you know, we say, you know, trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary is a valid identity, you know, worthy of respect. We also, I think, really importantly say that trans rights are not in opposition to women's rights, you know, ever. It's not true that, you know, when trans exclusionary feminists say, you know, you're agitating for your rights is kind of undermining our rights because it's letting you into our spaces. And, you know, actually, no, that's not the case. If trans people lose out, women also will lose out. Not least, actually, because trans women are women. We're clear about this. We don't define woman or the sex as purely biological. That's a kind of sex essentialist position, which unfortunately some people, some feminists, and I should say there are many, many feminists who don't take this position. They've got a good socialist feminist position and, you know, understand it. Sarah Ahmed in the UK, for instance, and others are good on this issue. You know, and, you know, hopefully most socialists don't take that position as well. Sex is not just biological, it also has social, political, ideological, you know, connotations as well. You can't isolate the biological. If you do, it puts you in a position of, you know, a sex essentialist position. And if you go down that particular rabbit hole, especially as a socialist or a Marxist, it's a very vulgar understanding of what Marx meant by materialism. It's a crude understanding, and it's actually wrong because you will end up on the wrong side of history. Actually, you know, the good thing is that most socialists, most feminists, most progressives are with trans people. And it's been heartening to see the number of cisgender women who have stood up, gone on social media, gone into the press and said, I stand with trans people, I stand with trans women. And there are all sorts of, you know, counterattacks kind of going on. So that, to me, that should be our starting point. And it's, as I say, a position, you know, which Lenin and the Bolsheviks held. It feeds into, you know, what they did after the Russian Revolution in terms of fighting for women's rights, making all sorts of changes, which I guess we'll talk about perhaps a bit later in the meeting on family, but, you know, many, many changes, and which also, within a couple of months of the Russian Revolution of 1917, they decriminalised homosexuality, which was actually the second country to do that in the world, and was 50 or 60 years ahead of most of the rest of Europe in doing that. Although I have to say, I don't know what the law here is, to be honest, but in the UK, it's not fully decriminalised. You know, it's partially decriminalised. Just as abortion is partially decriminalised. Just as an aside, by the way, there was a woman just a few days ago in the UK who was just acquitted after 4 years of being taken to court for having a self-administered abortion. She's had 4 years of that. She was reported when she went for help to a midwives in the local hospital, and they reported her because she'd self-medicated with abortion pills, and, you know, the police prosecuted. And there are a number of, this is happening more and more in the UK, by the way. So it's not true that abortion is without limits, you know, in the UK. Anyway, that's aside. So, you know, where does this all leave us? It leaves us, I think, in a position where we are very, very clear as Marxists. Marxism it's a theory of, you know, liberation. It's a theory and practice of human liberation. It allows us to understand the role of the family, the history of the family, why we have homophobia, transphobia, ideological attacks on these now. Why do we have these? It's the nature of capitalism. It's transphobia or trans really. Transphobia has a role to play. Being trans is. Am I running over already?
A little bit, but no.
Down to naught, aren't we? I will finish with this so that we can talk about more.
You're so interesting in your speech.
Yeah, sorry, I do tend to. My mouth runs away with me sometimes. I think I'll leave it there actually, because we can talk about more in the discussion, can't we? Otherwise, I'll ramble on for another 10 minutes, but there won't be any time for discussion. So that's our position. I'm convinced it's absolutely the right position to hold, and we are on the right side of history. In the UK, the Socialist Workers Party has a really strong position, and a number of young people have joined us in recent times precisely because we've got that strong position, and we will not give up on the question of fighting for trans rights, LGBT rights, and so on. And we have a long history of that, actually. I remember an article in 1978, Tony Cliff, the founder of the SWP and the tendency of which we're all part, wrote an article in Socialist Worker, 1978, when it was not really that popular on the left, and the Stalinists were much stronger. Stalinists have been terrible on this issue, by the way, in the UK, terrible, saying why socialists should support gay rights, as it was then called. Yeah. So we have a long history of support and fighting for our comrades, fighting particularly in their workplaces for LGBT rights, and so on. And we're going to need to do that more. We made a great start, I think, in the UK. Going to need to do it everywhere, as you are doing, because it is still going to be a big issue down the line, because they're seen as a vulnerable group. It's the 1% who are the richest and the most powerful attacking the 1% who are trans, and using that to drive through their authoritarianism and their right-wing agenda. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wenn du mehr zu diesem Thema oder Linkswende erfahren willst, abonniere unsere Social-Media-Kanäle und schau dich auf linkswende.org um. Wir sind ein antikapitalistischer Verein für Aktivistinnen und Aktivisten. Wenn du aktiv werden willst, melde dich gerne bei uns. Wir sehen uns sicher auf der nächsten Demo. MARX is MUSS von Linkswende. Radikal und selbstbewusst links.
Völker, hört die Signale, auf zum letzten Gefecht.